My father died about 14 years ago, so it's okay to talk about it now. And at the time that he passed away, there was so many decisions to make. I'm the oldest of 7 siblings, and we had never planned a funeral before, which is going to be painfully obvious in about a minute or two. So we find ourselves in Forest Lawn and in this grieving room, and the grief counselor's there, and they're asking so many questions, and we have to make so many decisions about the viewing, the memorial, what's on the casket, what's on picking the casket, what's on the tombstone, all these things. And 7 of us are sitting there, and then the grief counselor leaves the room, and we're like, we don't know what to do. And we sit there in stunned silence for a moment or two, and my brother Greg says, in West Africa, the caskets are made from a single piece of wood, and it's a West African fantasy casket. And if the person's a fisherman, they carve it to look like a boat, and that they go into the next world like that. And it's a status thing. So we're sitting there, and we go. Pretty soon the conversation goes to, well, why should we pay $10,000 for a box? Just a regular old box, when maybe, okay. Now picture Seinfeld, an episode of Seinfeld, when the door flies open and Kramer runs in and goes, Tuesday, we can get a casket. A West African fantasy casket from this artist I know in San Francisco who has a show. And so we go, okay, I guess, And our dad was so special, and he was so eccentric, and we really wanted to honor his eccentricity and not just be, in a box. So, it was kind of the only happy moment in the planning because it was something kind of different. And I said, well, what is it going to be for our dad? And he said, that's the great part. It is a Corvette, like he drove. And so we're like, okay, that's a sign. And then I said, well, this guy has one on hand, a Corvette. And he says, yeah, well, these are fantasy caskets, and they do plan this way ahead, and a lot of people want something like that, and we can get it on Tuesday, and the memorial's on Wednesday. So we just said, okay, go with it. Everybody had jobs to do. Somebody had to line up stuff with the church, and I was writing the obituary. So now we cut to the viewing, and we're in a really small room again, and it's full of flowers and full of people, so we never really got to see how inappropriate it was to be resting inside a car with the hood up and my dad wearing a tuxedo inside. And people did not help us out. Our relatives, the people that came they were like, that's a car, all right. And they're saying things like, Conrad did have a Corvette. And we're all like, yes. And it took us all the way from the sadness to the point about, yes, it's a West African fantasy casket, and we got it on Tuesday, and the artist lives in San Francisco, and who wants to pay $10,000 for a stupid box anyway? And everybody got into that kind of mentality, and nobody was grieving, and it was kind of like a good diversion until we got to the church the next day. And then it was, all right, well, let me just say, it wasn't that my dad was in like a slot car or a toy box kind of thing. The horror was the size, because it was only about, I guess, like 5 feet 8 inches long, and a casket is really long, maybe 8 feet or something. And so when it's coming down the aisle of the church with pallbearers that are just like front to back, because there's really no room for them, they're just like inching down, carrying it. And it could have been carried under somebody's arm like a surfboard in actuality, because it was so small. But everybody was aghast in the church. They looked back and they went from like sad eyes reading the rosary to revulsion and horror at this debacle coming down the Catholic Church. And the worst of it was that the priest had an incense ball over the front like this, which only made it look like the radiator was overheating. I'm not exaggerating anything. I couldn't make this up. So afterwards, we're all on the steps of the church, and we go, we cannot go through this tomorrow. Tomorrow he's going to be lowered into the ground. There's going to be more people. We cannot go through this debacle. And then they'll have, and the Navy was sending over a guy to play taps with the bugle. It would probably sound like a horn honking. So we call up Forest Lawn and get mad at them and say, what are you doing sending this over? We need a proper box. We need a proper burial. And they did it in time, and we donated the West African fantasy casket to the Baltimore Visionary Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, and it was on display for 5 years. And my dad was eccentric, and he left his mark, and quite literally because there was a trace of embalming fluid in the casket that they never mentioned, and they were just happy to have it, and my dad lives on. I'm not kidding, it's true. Thank you.